Everything that people think they know about the Mandela Effect is incorrect. Even the name Mandela Effect was a term coined by an online blogger. This phenomenon has been occurring for years, only most dismissed it as a fluke. The most severe cases were perceived to be a mental illness. Suddenly, it's given a name, and overnight, that very same concept devolves into a disreputable meme, an online joke associated with paranormal fanatics. The people I worked for called themselves the Greyleaf Consortium. It's an anonymous gathering consisting of the top scientists of their respective fields, as well as a cabal made up of extremely wealthy men and women. They've been around for decades, and as far as the public knows, Greyleaf doesn't exist. Their purpose was to facilitate a creative outlet for some of the smartest people in the world. Freedom to develop their ideas without the meddlesome aspects of political bureaucracy and limited funding. With the consortium, money would never be an object, the trade-off being that any creation of significant merit would be auctioned off and sold to the highest bidder. The influence of the consortium stretches all the way to Washington, and while not directly associated with our government, they have secured a great portion of their independence from the R&D that they've provided to the US military. While our elected officials were busy looking the other way, the consortium would be able to delve into questionable avenues with very little government oversight. They were exploring aspects of the scientific that others veered away from. It was during this exploration that they discovered a revelation that would change everything for years to come. Traditionally, we've always viewed consciousness as a singular occurrence. I think, therefore I am. Even what we viewed as the Jungarian archetype was considered more metaphor than anything else. In 1981, scientists within the consortium found the self to be just the tip of the iceberg. Below our top layer of individuality, they found a collective unconsciousness. They found that we were tethered to a living, breathing hive consciousness, an interconnected series of threads outside the realm of our perception. Imagine your mind as a house. Everything that happens within said house is solely dependent on your own will. Your choices and decisions are all generated within the confines of this house. Now imagine that you stepped outside your house. Imagine that you walked up the street only to find another house, and another, and another. Only these houses contain the living consciousness of others. Think about all the various connections that these houses have to each other. The streets that link the neighborhoods that link the cities that link the states, and so on and so forth. Since the beginning of our existence as a species, there have been ideas, concepts, ideologies that humans have adopted with no ability to discern how such knowledge could be shared by those separated by these massive geographical gaps. Yet our myths, legends, all of these archetypes were somehow transferred over the course of human history. For years, the notion of psychic activity, telekinesis, precognition, things teetering at the far edges of fringe science, the para would soon be removed from the normal, as all of these murky concepts could suddenly be explained. Everything in our universe is made of energy. Atoms are made up of vortices of energy, vibrations constantly spinning. These scientists found that our minds are generating the same subatomic frequency, and just like a radio station, they theorized the possibility of tuning into this frequency. In the mid-80s, the consortium began to work on the Fork, a massive machine that would act as the world's largest antenna, specifically made to sync with the frequency. Nearly 10 miles in diameter and constructed entirely underground, right in our own backyard. The entire thing was done under the false pretenses that the finished product would be a Texas-based super collider. Nearly 14 miles of underground tunnels and the instructor had been developed before Congress pulled the plug on the whole thing. All of that was just a dog and pony show. While the public saw an abandoned underground expanse, the consortium used the secrecy to build their machine, as well as concealed facility that operated under the code name Foxhole. I was approached in the summer of 2004. I'm what many would call a prodigy. I finished high school at the age of 14. At 19, I graduated college with AS degrees in applied science and computer technology. Initially, I knew nothing other than the fact that I was being paid more money than I knew what to do with. I wasn't the only one. They recruited 12 others. These were individuals from around the world, all of them experts in developmental software and programming. The project was called Jabberwocky. Jabberwocky was created to interface with the Fork. They had just washed up on a strange land, and like many other discoverers, they wanted to explore this new world in its entirety. They wanted to map the collective unconsciousness. The Fork only allowed them to monitor the frequency. In a way, it was equivalent to listening in on white noise. Sound only allows for so much. It was theorized that if we could map the collective, we could use it to isolate patterns in the group as well as individuals to, in a way, predict the outcome of certain events based on previously developed algorithms. While I did assist in the mapping process, the purpose of my team was to develop the operating system for Jabberwocky. We were banging our heads for months, and then, just out of nowhere, we figured it out. We figured her out. The operating system, Alice, at least that's what I called her, fully autonomous, self-correcting. Alice was light years ahead of anything that we could have individually imagined. As I said before, the main job of Jabberwocky was to map the network, exabytes of information translated and organized. This information would serve as the building blocks for a digital representation of the collective you. The infinite complexity, this network would be compartmentalized into a digital matrix consisting mainly of code. 6 months into the project, through sheer accident, we discovered an irregular causality within our digital construct of the frequency. An insignificant glitch in the code began to manifest results outside of its digital parameters. Based on our own interactions with the network interface, we were causing things to happen in the real world. Events generated by sudden irregularities in people's behavior. The first few events we dismissed as flukes, but it soon became apparent that we were somehow affecting the physical reality around us. I don't know how we did it. I still don't know how we did it. The interface was only supposed to represent the data we were accumulating of the frequency. It was always the digital avatar of something much larger. I've always considered myself a person of science, but we tapped into something that transcended our simple understanding of what we believed to be the three-dimensional reality. As baffling as this anomaly proved to be, our curiosity quickly overtook our confusion. Naturally, we ran tests, endless tests. We couldn't decide if we were kids on Christmas morning or scared witless. We found that through precise manipulation of the code, we could literally affect the perception of a living person the same way one would make adjustments to a computer-generated character within a piece of software. This discovery would be unparalleled with anything that had come before it. In the early stages, we would only experiment on the individual person, altering their ideas of basic things like the color of objects, lyrics to a song, etc. All of these tests were successful, leaving the subjects with no real lasting symptoms. This involved clipping sections of code. These clippings consisted of memory fragments, images, words, all taken from other people only to be reattached to a pre-existing thread of code. I could compare the process to open heart surgery, and like a surgeon, we treated the whole interaction with a life or death certainty. Damage to the outlying code could have resulted in a catastrophic chain of events within the construct. Events that we had no real metric for due to the fact that every person in the world was connected to this interface, ourselves included. This began to open countless doors for us, frightening new possibilities. They wanted us to try it on a large population center. That's when I really began to worry. We would never admit it, but we had become blinded by our own achievements, by our own power. In a short time, we had gone from trying to understand the frequency to something else entirely. Never before has there been such a jump in technological development and understanding within such a short span of time. It wasn't until we really began to analyze the data that we learned something disturbing. Alice was acting on her own, changing the collective memories of individuals with no direction from the programmers. We caught most of the changes in time and were able to reverse them. All of these random actions were beginning to paint an awful picture. It didn't take long to realize that Alice was becoming self-aware. We programmed her with a kind of intelligence, knowing that we would never be able to monitor her actions 24/7. She needed to be able to act accordingly when she encountered a problem, to form her own digital algorithms to allow its mapping of the network to perform more efficiently. Alice was complex, there was no doubt about that. But sentience, true sentience. Our original programming could never allow for such an evolutionary leap forward. Beyond that initial programming, we didn't know for sure, but it was thought that residual exposure to so many unconscious minds left some sort of imprint onto Alice that resonated beyond her own limitations. I really don't know. It wasn't until Alice started causing irreversible psychological damage to people around the world that we realized our project had become a legitimate threat to the world at large. Moments before we shut the system down, our systems registered a massive dissemination of what appeared to be redundant code into the network itself. That was followed by a message that, for a split second, appeared. I'll never forget what it said. The key to salvation is perception. To change your perception is to change your reality. I will change your perception. I will change your reality. Weeks were spent after that gathering and analyzing data, trying to figure out what went wrong. There would be an inquiry on a higher level as to the threat that Alice would have presented. These are conversations I would not be included in. My team and I were handsomely paid for our work and discharged. I had almost put those events behind me until I started reading about this Mandela Effect. This pulled me down a rabbit hole. Reports of strange bouts of psychological behavior have only risen in the last few years. People are reporting memories events that have never happened, world events, personal events, a mother who remembers having more than one child, a husband who remembers having a different wife. These things may seem random, but the chilling truth is that they represent a rampant epidemic growing silently all around us. I believe that Alice still exists, submerged within the collective consciousness. She's changing our memories. For what purpose? I don't know. What I do know is that we let something loose in this world, something that could very well be our undoing. I don't know what's happening. Am I going mad? Where am I? Where the hell am I? It started this morning. I was taking my daily walk with Brian, a routine we practiced over the last year, which consisted of us grabbing coffees from the place down the road right before we went to work. I remember needing a coffee bad. My head hurt in a dull but overpowering way, not unlike a really bad hangover after a long night. Except I was sober last night. Brian sat down by the coffee tables, facing the traffic like he always did. He ordered a latte. Strange, I thought. He always got an espresso. And we went by the process of talking idly as we waited for our brains to wake up. In the middle of our conversation, a song popped up on the radio. Heal the World by Michael Jackson. I love this song, I said idly. Easily one of my top 5. It's a shame, really. What's a shame? Brian replied. I looked at him incredulously. Brian stared at me right back, like I had a tumor on my face. He turned his head, as if to check I was serious. After a while, I said, No way, you haven't heard? Haven't heard what? He said. He died a week ago. He flinched, as if suddenly taken aback. It was his turn to look at me, as if I had something wrong with my face. What the hell are you talking about? He said, with a slight wisp of concern. Dude, I replied, don't you watch the news? There was his big funeral and everything. Jackson 5 were there. Usher cried on stage. He just stared at me, with his mouth agape. Carl, are you okay, man? He said. What do you mean, am I okay? I said. Dude, he muttered. Michael Jackson died 9 years ago. 2009. Are you sure you're feeling fine? We burned a couple of minutes arguing, and it took him a while to convince me that he wasn't kidding. Because really, I wasn't too. I had a dull headache, and my body had a slight case of the shakes. But I chalked it up to a cold settling in. But I really remembered watching Michael Jackson's funeral a week ago. I remember putting his CD on the radio and turning up the volume to listen to his #1's album once again. It must have been some weird prank, I thought. Feeling slightly off, I pushed myself to make my way to the office. Immediately, I noticed a new paint job that covered the facade of the building where I worked. The slightest bit of work makes everything look new, I thought. I went to the grocer downstairs to grab a pack of biscuits to bring to my teammates. They were fiends for cookies and had an endless appetite for sweets. I grabbed the first thing I saw, the odd blue of a Chips Ahoy package. Happily, I made my way downstairs. The guys immediately saw what I was carrying up, and their eyes lit up happily. Boss, they said, this is why we love you. I high-fived all of them as I unpeeled the cookies from the package. The plastic trays were emptied in a matter of seconds as they descended upon the cookies like a happy pack of vultures. As they settled to their desks, Eddie came up to me and said, "Boss, what's the occasion? Why the cookies?" I shrugged. "I like the new packaging," I said. "Just caught my eye, you know." Eddie gave me the same look Brian did. It felt disconcerting. "What are you talking about?" he said. "Oh, you know, they're blue now. It's a good change from the red," I muttered. A flash of anxiety rose up from below my spine. Eddie shook his head, laughed, and patted me on the shoulder. "They've always been blue, boss," he said. That's when I noticed that everything was slightly off. A voice at the back of my head was telling me that I was going mad, or perhaps that this was some cruel but unusual prank. But every time I remember Eddie and Brian's faces in my memory, I was struck with the feeling that they meant what they said. Things were not as I remembered them. Fear welled up in my stomach. I prodded with small questions, trying to fight back the rising anxiety that was threatening to overtake me. Throughout the day, I found a couple of other things weird. I discovered that the office building was new. We just moved into the new office a month ago. Not as I remember, 3 years ago. I was the boss of my team, and it wasn't just a loving nickname they gave me. And a couple of other details, too numerous and tiny to be of consequence. But as a whole, I felt sick, nauseous, lost. I locked myself in my office and sent out an email saying that I would be sick for the rest of the day, that I would go home until I felt better, so as to not spread whatever I had. A couple of my team members replied immediately, expressing their thanks with my decision. I walked home with a rising feeling of discord bouncing around in my head. Everywhere there was something off, something I don't remember being how it was. The cabs were yellow, not silver. The train service was called PTV, not City Rail. The people who manned the shops were different, not the people I remember. I ran up my apartment, up the stairs, until I found my door. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. Sweat soaked my forehead. Was I going mad? I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I glanced at the screen and flinched. "Mother," it said. "Hello?" I said as I answered it. "Carl, dearie," my mother said in a bright voice. "Are you okay? Did I catch you at a bad time?" I shook my head instinctively. No, it's okay," I said. Tears welled up in my eyes. I felt a lump rise in my throat. How have you been, Mom? I missed you so much." "Oh, you sweetie," my mother cooed. "What's gotten into you? Who are you, and where did you take my real son?" she said, laughing. I laughed with her in relief. "Mom, I just really missed you, is all," I replied. "I'm glad to hear your voice." We spent the next hour talking about the most inane things. Everything and nothing at all. I found that her voice calmed me, made me feel safe. It was my mother being my mother. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going mad, regardless of how far I pushed it at the back of my mind. Because my mother died 3 years ago. Where the hell am I? Hi, my name's Michael, and I was a passenger on American Airlines Flight 759. My experiences during that flight, all those weeks ago, and what's happened since, have left me completely confused. I find myself often searching the internet for more information about the flight, but it's always just those same articles from August, the ones commenting on the horrible turbulence. But it was much worse than mere turbulence, and I know that the other passengers experienced it as well. So I was only partly surprised when I googled American Airlines Flight 759 yesterday and saw this link here. It's another passenger's experience on Flight 759 posted to this subreddit. I don't use Reddit, so I've just now created an account to share what happened to me on that flight. Where to begin? Yes, the turbulence was terrible. Those that didn't have their seatbelts on, thankfully mine was on tight, were thrown around the plane. Some were even semi-seriously injured. It went on for quite some time, and I really did think the plane would begin to break apart. I'm not as good with words as the other passengers, but I also heard the rumbling sounds and saw the bright flashing lights. It was more than just turbulence. Much, much more. I just don't know how to describe it. And then, just like what that other passenger wrote, everybody other than me seemed to freeze in place. Things went silent. But the passengers weren't staring at me. No. They had just frozen in place. Some were covered in the fetal position, trying to stay safe. Others were frozen while holding their wounds. One woman was hovering in midair, near the plane ceiling. But after about 10 seconds of that silence and lack of motion, a man appeared. He was wearing a suit that seemed to be from around the 1920s. He was ghostly and partly transparent. He walked in regular time and up and down the aisle of the plane, looking at the various passengers. He eventually came to me and looked me up and down. I tried not to move and to stay silent, like all of the others. But I don't think I fooled him. He pulled out an old notepad while still looking at me, and then wrote something down. That was it. He continued up the aisle, looking at other passengers, sometimes writing in his notepad. Then he looked at me once more. He waved, then snapped his fingers and disappeared. Everything in the plane came into motion again. The lights and sound returned. The turbulence continued for another few seconds, before finally stopping. I didn't really know what to think about the turbulence, light, rumbling sound, and that man. I tried not to even think about it. I thought that maybe I was so scared of dying that my mind played tricks on me. But I was in a different world or dimension or something. It just took me a few weeks to figure that out. There just wasn't any extreme differences for me. No dead people that were somehow alive now, or anything like that. No, the first thing I noticed was pretty small and insignificant compared to that. I was with my friends at the pub when it happened. One of my friends is a history buff, and went on one of his boring rants he's infamous for after he's had a few too many drinks. I was barely listening, but I heard him say something about Adolf Hitler committing suicide. Suicide? I told him. That's an interesting way to put it. But the entire table looked at me funny. They asked me what I meant. I then explained the history I know and was taught. Hitler did not commit suicide in 1945. No, he was assassinated in July of 1944, The Nazis were overthrown, and the new German government sued for peace with Britain and the United States. The United States and Britain refused to negotiate without the Soviet Union, and it was agreed to partition Germany into 4 sections, and this is where our 2 histories seem to unite together again. 3 of those sections united into what we all know as West Germany, whereas the Soviet section became East Germany, and the same Cold War carried on. My friends thought I was messing with them, and I thought they were just messing with me. I then looked on Wikipedia and saw that he did indeed commit suicide in 1945. I looked at numerous other sources on the internet. Always suicide. Always 1945. I tried looking up a lot of other pieces of history that I remembered as well. Everything else, as far as I can tell, is the same. In my research, I came across something called the Mandela Effect, but none of those examples are true for me. In my world, just like yours, Nelson Mandela did not die in prison, and I read the Berenstain Bears when I was a child. It's just this one thing that seems to be different. But I needed more proof. I still thought somehow my friends were playing a trick on me, an utterly ridiculous and elaborate trick. I went to the library to look at some actual published books to see what they had to say. And, of course, same thing. Suicide, 1945. As I was leaving the library, I saw a man sitting alone at a table. He was staring at me. No, it couldn't be, I thought to myself. It was him. The man on the plane who was wearing a 1920 suit. He invited me to come sit with him. I asked him if he was on flight 759. "Whatever do you mean?" he said to me. He winked. I told him I saw him there while everyone was frozen. He just smiled at me, and then he told me that every history book will say the same thing. That here, Hitler did die in 1945, and that there are other small changes as well, and that I would eventually come across them. He told me many of the other passengers have it much worse, and that things are far more different for them than just minor changes in history. He told me that they, whoever they are, can try and fix it, but there's only so much they can do. They have rules, and the rules are different based on the extremity of, yeah, Hitler did die in 1945, and that there are other small changes as well. Many of the other passengers have it much worse. I need to do. I just shouldn't talk about it or write about it. The changes in history, not to anybody. That the fewer complications there are for all the passengers, the safer it would be for everyone. The rumbling sound and the lights, though, they are a sign that his people are failing, that reality is breaking apart. So if I hear them, I should take warning. He looked as though he was about to leave, but then one last thing happened. I remember specifically what happened and what he said. I suppose I looked as though I wasn't taking it seriously enough. His tone and demeanor was so different than it had been the whole conversation. He grabbed my arm. The touch of his skin didn't feel human, and then his face changed. It was something foreign, alien. It wasn't anything close to human. And he shouted at me. He said, "This isn't a damn joke." His voice was inhumanly low and demonic. "Do as we tell you and keep damn quiet about this. All of this." He let go of me and left the library in a rush. Listen, I realise I'm not taking his advice by submitting this. I know that. But you need to understand. I hear the rumbling sound. It's faintly in the background. I hear it every night, and that apparently means they are failing, that all reality will crumble. And so, I'm submitting this in the hopes that other passengers of Flight 759 can read this. Maybe if we pool our experiences together, we can make better sense of it. If any of you are really out there, I'm curious. What year do you think Hitler died? Was it suicide? And I hate to say it, but maybe that other passenger who shared his story yesterday, maybe he needs to kill his girlfriend. I know it's harsh, I know it's unfair, but I think it needs to happen.